Bonjour, good morning, buenos días. I'm Guillermo de los Reyes. Je ne parle pas bien français. I will speak in English. I can speak in Spanish too. I'm a professor at the University of Houston, and I'm one of the vice presidents for the Policy Studies Organization. Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to be the chair of this panel today, that we will start with Professor Peter Lancidi. Professor Lancidi is a tenure assistant professor in the Institute of Art History at ELTE University in Budapest. As an Azrieli Fellow, he earned his PhD in the Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University in Warsaw, with background in art history and aesthetics from Budapest and Jewish studies. He's a master's from Stockholm and Heidelberg. His research focuses on the interface between Freemasonry and Kabbalah in visual material in the 19th century and its historical and cultural context. And also I'm a board member of the REMLAC, one of the Masonic journals, and he's a great contributor of REMLAC. Thank you, Peter. And the topic of his paper is here, Sapientia Generalis from Christology to Tolerance through Freemasonry. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and speak to this distinguished audience. So with that, I'll start straight with my talk. So in 1843 in Paris, David Rosenberg, a Freemason rabbi, published a lithograph by the title Sapientiae Generalis, together with an explicatory volume. The artwork, hitherto believed to be lost, is a copy of a 1679 Christological work of a Capuchin monk, Esprit Sabatier, titled Idealis Sapientiae Generalis, Idealis Umbra Sapientiae Generalis, meaning the ideal shadow of universal wisdom. The large print presents the summary of universal knowledge in a systematic way through hundreds of symbols, allegoric figures, and tiny narrative scenes arranged in a mandala-like concentric diagram. At the visual and conceptual center of the meticulously structured encyclopedic lithograph, we find Christ on the cross. Such a work from the hands of a rabbi is not simply surprising, but even astonishing. In my talk, I will first present the original artwork, and then we'll turn to Rabbi Rosenberg's lithograph and explications. I will show how Freemasonry holds the key to the intriguing riddle of why the rabbi published this Christological work, and I will elaborate on Rosenberg's reframing of the opus. The author of the Idealis Umbra Sapientiae Generalis, the French Capuchin Esprit Sabatier, was born around 1604 and died in 1676. His magnum opus, however, was published posthumously in 1679 in Paris, together with an explication in Latin and its French translation, L'ombre idéale de la sagesse universelle. The publishing, and in all likelihood the translation of the explication into French too, was overseen by Père François-Marie of Paris, friend and fellow Capuchin of Sabatier. The work, which is dedicated to Christ, the Pope, and the King, was first printed in April 1679 and was presented to Louis XIV, and it remained on display throughout the month of April in the Sun King's chamber. The work was also sent to Rome, where in September it was presented to the Pope, Innocent XI. His Holiness received this present with great joy and benevolence, and did not less admire the work and spirit of this piece than he praised the invention. Attest to the success of the work the fact that a large painting copy, like more than 2 meters by 2 meters, from the beginning of the 18th century survived in Italy. Now let me turn to the engraving, or to be more precise, engravings for both the chart and the explication were engraved. The explication was printed on one large folio, divided into 24 leaves in 3 columns. Most of the extant copies are in book format, in which the leaves cut out from the large folio are mounted on blind double leaves. The large size engraving is 1.1 meter by 1 meter, was drawn after the iconographic program and self-drawn design of Sabatier. It outlines the main structure of the diagram in a schematic manner, but with all the necessary inscriptions. The engraving is the work of François Chauveau and François Commartin. Chauveau was one of the most notable French artists of the 17th century, member of the Académie, and holder of the title Graveur du Roi. Chauveau is well remembered for his innovations. It is estimated that he authored more than 3,000 pieces, cartouches, vignettes, frontispieces, etc., amongst them more than 1,600 engravings. Commartin, who is known mainly for his topographical works, did the lettering. Accordingly, the artistic parts of the engraving, allegorical figures and emblem-like tiny scenes numbering over 100, must have been invented by Chauveau, following the artistic trends of the period when the genre of emblems with its complex interplay between text and image was in vogue in France. Commartin, on the other hand, must have been responsible for the execution of the lettering and perhaps the drawing of the diagram itself. Having said that, since Chauveau died in the same year as Sabatier, it is likely that some of the scenes were finished by Commartin, perhaps following the acquiescence of Chauveau. Before turning our attention to the encyclopedic aspect of the work, a few words seem appropriate here about the title of the Christological content. Christ is postulated as the source and synthesis of all sciences. As Sabatier explains, and I quote, "It is from him, through him, and in him that all things are. He is the one who possesses the treasures of wisdom, holds the key to science to open and close it at his will, without anyone else being able to open or close it." End of quote. He further clarifies the idea behind the title, the light-darkness symbolism, by announcing that he who wished to place his throne in the sun took pleasure in surrounding it with darkness, which is why Sabatier's work is at best an ideal shadow of the universal wisdom. Accordingly, the entire system of science is explained and demonstrated through Christ. It is along the 4 cardinal points of the crucified Christ that Sabatier draws up its Catholically Christian way, the knowledge of the universe. Now, Christian Kabbalistic speculations are recurring features of the work. He equates Kabbalah with the theology of the Hebrews, but explains, and I quote again, "Perhaps this mixture of Christian mysteries with those of the Jews under a foreign language surprises you and makes you suspect something fastidious. Far from it. It is here that those two religions hide their holy alliance to show us that the secrets and sacred tradition of the Hebrews, which they call Kabbalah, is perfectly suited to our mysteries in the person of Jesus Christ." Now, Sabatier declared that just as there is only one light, there is only one truth, and thus this same truth forms by its unity only one science. This idea forms the basis of his all-encompassing system of sciences, to which he refers as a Catholically Christian encyclopedia. Sabatier's grand encyclopedic enterprise was a product of the intellectual endeavors of his time. Captivated by the pursuit of universal wisdom, theologians such as Montarcis, Vassy, the Carmelite Léon de Saint-Jean, and the Capuchin Yves de Paris were representatives of the big encyclopedic tradition of the period, chasing the utopian dream of systematizing all knowledge. Sabatier explains that all my aim is to reduce to one the multitude of sciences which divide the unity of the universal wisdom into so many parts, or to compose of all their different methods into only one. Basically, it was a kind of general method for all the sciences. Of all the branches of sciences, to four, Sabatier assigns distinguished positions. They are the mothers and queens of the others: metaphysics, moral, physics, and ideosophy. This latter one is Sabatier's invention, which is elevated even further into a special position. The ideosophicia considers them, the sciences, all as its daughters, because they all come out of it and descend from it. The most distinguishing feature of Sabatier's encyclopedic work is its visuality. Sabatier's diagram design clearly bespeaks of its Lulist origin, being inspired by Lul's diagrams with their mnemonic features. And indeed, the library of one of the important French Lulists, the aforementioned Montarcis, included 3 manuscript copies of Lul's works that had belonged to Sabatier. It is to be remarked that Sabatier made Lull the patron of ideosophy, the science of sciences. The diagram was also referred to as a map by contemporaries, and Sabatier himself also referred to his chart as a plan and a carte. This mind map feature of the diagram is nicely encapsulated in the way the Capuchin monk phrased one of its advantages. It provides an easy path to each science. And indeed, the work was praised for the memory, for the memory is relieved by the order of economy that prevails throughout this beautiful work. Now, before turning to Rabbi Rosenberg's work, let me say a few words about him. David Rosenberg was born in 1793 in Tokaj, the capital of the famous Hungarian wine region. He served as rabbi in German lands for more than 10 years, where, besides teaching drawing to children, he learned the craft of lithography, which was to become the leading printing technology of the 19th century. In 1827, he moved to the Netherlands, where he was initiated into Freemasonry, and in 1830, he moved to Paris, where he stayed until 1844. He secured an employment for himself in the Department of Prints, Geographic Maps and Plans of the Royal Library, where he was tasked with the reduction of maps, various topographic and calligraphic works. It was in Paris that his Masonic and artistic career, not unrelated to each other, took off. He became member in the famous Loge des Trinosophes and later in the Lodge of Aristocrats, the Loge des Chevaliers Croisés. It was mainly with his Kabbalistic Masonic lithographs that he made a name for himself. We are very lucky to have actually one of his chefs-d'œuvre here with us in flash from the archive of the Grand Orient. And for a minute, I'll just show you the print. Thank you, Pierre. So this is the Miroir de la Sagesse, in which he fuses Kabbalah and Freemasonry together in the Sephirotic triad in the middle. Yes. So maybe I'll just wait 1 minute, because I see that this work really detracts attention for all good reasons. Merci beaucoup, Pierre. So I'll continue with the talk. In 1842, Rosenberg was sent on a diplomatic mission to London to help bring about an alliance between the Grand Lodge of France and the United Grand Lodge of England. The mission was unsuccessful, nevertheless it was successful on a personal level. The rabbi had a chance to meet the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, His Royal Highness Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, who was a well-known Hebraist. Rosenberg presented to the Duke his latest lithograph by the title Aperçu de l'origine du culte hébraïque, Origin of the Rites and Worship of the Hebrews, of which the Duke expressed his unqualified approbation. What is more, His Royal Highness even suggested Rosenberg another suitable subject for his artistry, the Sapientiae Generalis. As a matter of fact, Masonic interest in the Sapientiae Generalis is attested by several sources. The Souverain Chapitre Métropolitain, a body that was created in 1788 to administer high degrees, possessed a copy. Also, a copy existed of Sabatier's explication that is stamped throughout with the triangular device of the Rite d'écorché philosophique, an alchemically oriented Masonic system. Another copy was in the library of Gaillata, who in 1887 founded the Kabbalistic order of the Rose Cross. And in fact, there's also a copy, or at least the upper part of the original Sabatier print in the archive of the Grand Orient. So as soon as Rosenberg arrived back in Paris, he set to work. The lithograph was ready by September 1843. The most striking difference between the 1679 engraving and Rosenberg's lithograph are the frame and the coloring. The four sides and the corners of the gate-like structure feature various interconnected themes and architectural elements. At the top, we see a celestial sphere with the letter Yod at its center point, beneath which God is portrayed. On the two sides, the four elements are depicted with allegorical Puto-like figures. At the bottom, a terrestrial sphere and a woman below are to be seen, the universal mother, flanked by the representations of the four seasons. The right side of the border is dedicated to creation. The allegorical figures of woman and man standing on a terrestrial and a celestial spheres are depicted, and the fruit of their love, an infant in the interior. Above and below are the 12 signs of the zodiac. The theme of the left side is the sun. Its annual movement is projected onto the wall in the interior of an orientalizing structure. Above and below, the allegorical figures and symbols of the planets and recently discovered comets can be seen. Displayed in the four corners are the temples of the Jewish, Indian, Egyptian, and Christian religions with the ternary inscriptions. The explication of Rosenberg, with some exception, is a verbatim copy of Sabatier's text, complemented with a preface and an introduction. And these are the most interesting parts of the rabbi's book, explicatory book. He starts with some musings over the aim and history of philosophy and the human endeavor to acquire knowledge. One of the means by which this knowledge was believed to be attainable, writes Rosenberg, was through contemplating on the absolute infinite being. He writes that Father Sabatier followed this path and found the true source, Judea. In fact, that was the starting point of all the religious doctrines of the modern world, but while embracing these ideas, Sabatier had to reject these claims because of the intolerant intellectual climate. And from here on, Rosenberg ponders over the issue of intolerance and tolerance and asks the question, Does the professed religion make us different in essence and nature? We are subject to the same laws of nature by our birth, existence, and death, and religions and beliefs are likewise equal for all. After announcing his credo and his trust in the century of freedom of conscience, he delivers a panegyric on France which proclaimed liberty and equality for all religions and where the civic law is equal to all. And I quote, the merit of a citizen is recognized and rewarded without distinction of worship, end of quote. Rosenberg ends this more than 8 pages long preface with the following paragraph, and I quote, "Let us hope that this system, which combines so well with that of Father Sabatier, will soon spread throughout the world, that one day all distinctions of worship will disappear completely from the face of the earth, and that freedom of conscience and equality of rights will shine forth with an unalterable radiance. Yes, this is the object of our most ardent wishes. May the Almighty God deign to allow them to be fulfilled soon." That is, Rosenberg framed Sabatier's work with a 19th century discourse and reinterpreted it not only as an example of tolerant latitudinarian work, but also as one that builds upon Jewish tradition. And this argumentative framing was turned into a tangible frame on the lithograph. Apparently, Rosenberg's framing was successful, for we read in the 1869 issue of the journal Freemason that the main object of Rosenberg's publication was to obtain support for the cardinal points of his creed, namely liberty and equality for all forms of religious worship, and the subject has a peculiar interest at the present time. Rosenberg, although we believe a professor of the Hebrew faith, speaks with the greatest reverence of Christ, whom he describes as the summary of perfection of all things. In concluding, the question begs to be asked, what could have been the reason for a rabbi, otherwise an ardent defender of conservative Judaism, to publish a lithograph with a huge crucified Christ in the middle and its Christological explication? The answer that suggests itself is to be found in the commission, or to be more precise, in the person who solicited the work, the Duke of Sussex, the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge. This was a commission that Rosenberg could not, and perhaps did not even want to refuse. However, that it caused him at least some cognitive dissonance should be clear already from certain details. He distanced himself from the opus by modifying the title, Sapientia Generalis Fidelibus Christianis Dicatum, general wisdom dedicated to faithful Christians. Furthermore, unlike all the other lithographs, the Sapientia Generalis does not carry Rosenberg's name. Also, in the explication, his name is indicated only by monogram. So while the rabbi lived an assimilated life in Paris, embraced the progressive civic values of France, and regarded Freemasonry as the sentinel of civilization, his tolerant attitude had limits. He was uneasy with publishing the Christological work of a Capuchin monk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes for questions. Pierre?
Oui, moins des questions que des compléments ou des...
More comments than questions. The Duke of Sussex is as known in the history of Freemasonry for her philosemitism, and when he was alive, some people thought that maybe he had become Jewish. So there's a strong philosemitism feeling from the Grand Master of the Grand United Lodge of England. And secondly, those relationships with Christianism started before the drawing of this engraving, because he was a member of the temple, which is a paramasonic organization that's very dynamic between 1804 and the Second Republic. It ended at the beginning of the Second Empire. And this Order of the Temple, the Templars are Christians, so the Order of the Temple had very broad conceptions of Christianism. They were kind of Unitarian. Jesus was a great prophet, etc. And Rosenberg, the fact that he was part of this lodge of the Rosicrucian Knights is part of the debate, because the traditional lodge of the Templars Knights was the Chevalier de la Croix of the Grotte Orient, and then they got into an argument. A certain number of them left, they went to the Grand Lodge, and that's what became the Rosicrucian Knights. And in this Masonic context, there are also explanations of this relationship between Rosenberg and Christianism. Then one last thing, we never know how the relationship works, but one of the very active Mason of this Neo-Templar Mason movement was one of the curator of the National Library. So maybe it was this relationship with this brother, I forgot his name, but maybe that's this relationship that has led him to follow this evolution of the Rosicrucian Knights. And regarding Rosenberg's relationship with Christianism, there's the idea of the temple in France in the 1830s, 1840s that we need to study in depth.
Oui, un paradoxe quand même.
There's a paradox when we see how there was this will to have more freedom of conscience expressed by the person, and it finishes with God Almighty at the end of the text that you showed. This is very paradoxical when we look at this with today's point of view, when we want an absolute freedom of conscience, this absolute freedom to believe or not believe any type of God. So we feel that there's a real contradiction in this text if we look at it with a modern point of view, of course.
Indeed, what's interesting about this, on the one hand, praising equality, and on the other hand, he's pushing sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, this Jewish origin of Freemasonry narrative, is that has to be viewed in a bit in the larger context, namely in what's going on in German lands, where Jews are excluded from the lodge. Even Jewish Freemasons are not allowed to visit lodges. So in some of the explications to some of the other lithographs he made, he has he really makes very strong statements against Germans, that how come that in the temple of tolerance such intolerance can happen, and what kind of obscurancy and what this is under the beam of the shining star such a darkness can exist. So he's really lashing out against the German lodges, and in contrast he praises the Freemasonry and the countries of France and Belgium, and so this is where he's like this. His civic heart is with France, but on the other hand, when he's lashing out against German lodges, he says that so against who they are really. Who are these people that they want to exclude? I mean, they are the Jews from whom Freemasonry comes forth. So he tries to like contrast this intolerance by saying that Freemasonry, I mean, obviously building upon the Temple of Solomon, a Masonic myth, that it is from Judaism that the Freemasonry brings its like sources. So that's why it's in throughout his writings you have this double approach. So on the one hand, complete tolerance for everyone, but on the other hand, he's trying to, or maybe he's proud himself on the Jewish sources. And I also think that one of the reasons why he was accepted into such as a Christian lodge is exactly because he's being Jewish and a rabbi and sort of a Kabbalist. And the reason for that is the trends in exactly in this period, in the first few decades of the 80s, when this genre of the tuileur appeared, in which one of the, especially in the Delaunay's tuileur, this philological part was very pronounced, in which he was trying to understand and explain the original meanings of the Hebrew words in the Masonic science, which became completely ununderstandable. I mean, it was distorted throughout oral transmission beyond recognition. And so, and also at the same time, there was this idea of this original mother religion, the religion of all religions, which many, of course, posited that it was Judaism. And so Rosenberg came as a rabbi and a Jew and a Kabbalist, so the ancient lore of Judaism. And basically, I think that with this position, he and his works promised to bring some kind of clarity, that he could bring these original ideas into light through his works. So I think this whole the intellectual environment in these years that really supported his being included into Masonic lodges, and that's why I think that his work, and especially this one that you've seen, the Miroir de la Sagesse, it was so well received and it resonated with the Masons, and this is the reason why there were so many impressions made later on. This, what you've seen, is actually not the original one. The original one is in gold. It's beautiful. It's like shining forth. But there were like other impressions made, and you can find it in English archives, even in the United States and in many other places.
Thank you. We're going to continue with the next speaker. The next speaker is Jean-Luc Lebrun. He's a senior professor of geography. He was cultural advisor in Gabon from 1984 to 1989, Côte d'Ivoire from 1989 to 1993, head of cooperation mission in Equatorial Guinea in 1998 to 2001, in the Central African Republic in 2001-2005, and then in Senegal from 2007 to 2012. He's a member of the Institute of Masonic Studies and Research, member of Sources, Research, Areopagus of the Supreme Council of the Grand Orient de France. He has publications, books, biographies, and many articles very important to Freemasonry, among them the one on the Anderson Constitutions. Jean-Luc, s'il vous plaît. And, everything is ready. This will be in French.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je vais peut-être
Would you like me to speak into the microphone, or can we do it without? Oh, it's for the interpreters. I apologize. So, I'm going to discuss a topic that I've been asked to cover. by Pierre Mollier, that is to say, how we went from the term Grand Large to the term Grand Orient in French. And so this is something that is very exciting and interesting, and which hasn't necessarily been dealt with. It has been mentioned from time to time in Masonic literature, but in reality, no one has really dwelled on this notion or tried to understand how this developed. And this is not just the case just for Masonic literature. Everyone knows what the Grand Orient of France is and how long it's existed. But I went to take a look in the dictionary, and I had to check the ordinary dictionary, not the Masonic dictionary. And in the ordinary dictionary, I had to wait until 1872 before the specificity of the word Orient in Masonry would be located in the Larousse of the 19th century. So that was in 1872. So 1 century later, people began to speak about the Masonic approach of the term Orient. Then in 1873, it was followed by Littré, who was a Freemason. But I found that perhaps by looking at the various editions of the French Academy dictionaries, I would be able to perhaps go back in time to 1873. However, I consulted all of the editions of the French Academy dictionary, and in fact the term Grand Orient or Grand Orient was never raised in the Masonic term. And so it wasn't until the 9th edition of the French Academy Dictionary that this topic would be raised. And this edition was published in 2011. So up until 2011, Eternal Orient, Grand Orient did not exist in the French dictionary. So I suggest that we approach this topic very quickly, and we'll break this presentation into 2 parts. So we'll talk about how we went from the term Grand Large to Grand Orient, and then something else that I find fairly interesting is that Grand Orient is not just a term, and you'll see this later on, that the period from 1773 to 1774 is fairly rich in this respect. Could somebody help me, please?
Ça y est, j'y viens.
So we're getting there. So I'm going to endeavor to just remind you of the context. It's important to have an idea of the context so as to understand what a Grand Large was and what a Grand Orient in France was. And so the context is important to have in mind. So just a chronology of the evolution of Masonry in France in the 18th century. So the first part of my presentation is entitled 1725 to 1743. Why 1725? Because it was the first lodge to be known in Paris. And why 1743? Well, because this was the death of Duc Bontin and also the arrival of the Count of Clermont. Now, I just need something to point at the screen. How does this work? Do I have to stand in front of it? How does it work?
Bon, ben on va se passer du pointeur alors.
Okay, so perhaps we'll do without the pointer. So the first period, so 1725 to 1728, so that's the period that we see on the left-hand side. There are lodges, but there are no Grand Masters. Then, did you just zoom in? Can we zoom out? And then the second period, so 1728 to 1737, there are lodges, there are Grand Masters, but the specificity of these Grand Masters is that they're not French. There was Wharton, who was a Grand Master of the French Grand Lodge, and then we had Maclean and Derwentwater. They were Grand Masters, but they didn't have an administration that we know today. So there weren't very many differences. In 1738, the Duke of Dantin then inaugurated the series of the Grand Masters in France. And what was special about these three Grand Masters in France is that all three descend from Madame de Montespan. So the Duke of Antin is the great grandson. They're all descendants of Madame Montespan, and their ancestor also is Legoire and Nantes. So these are descendants of Louis XIV. So until 1743, there were lodges and grand masters. So at this time, there was the Grand Master and the Grand Lodge, but there was no real administration, even if they did have some officers and they did have a secretariat. Following this was the period of the Count of Clermont. Are you going to switch the slides for me? That's perfect. Thank you very much. So from 1743 to 1771, where there was the arrival of the Count of Clermont, who was the Grand Master of French Masonry throughout this period. Nevertheless, we know that the Clermont Lodge had statutes and organization, but these were not the statutes of the Grand Lodge of France, even if his title was Grand Master of the lodges of the regular lodges of France. And we had to wait until the 1760s to see a structure based on statutes and regulations, and this would be a twofold organization. That is to say that there would be the first status in 1763, and then before that, the Grand Lodge of Penny, which also had statutes. So these statutes were drafted in 1763, and in 1767 the Grand Lodge was suspended. So this is something to remember, because when we talk about Grand Lodges and we want to refer to a Grand Lodge in France that existed in 1728, which sought to be the first in the French Masonry hierarchy, without this context it does not make sense. Now, the next slide is the slide that we'll be interested in, because at this period, 1771, 1773, this was the period throughout which the Grand Orient of France would be developed. So in 1771, the Grand Master and the Count of Clermont died on the 16th of June, 1771. On the 21st of June, the worshipful masters of the Paris Lodge were summoned, and in 1724 it was proposed that a new Grand Master would be appointed and would be the future Duke of Orleans in the Grussier Temple. Now, this Grand Lodge of France, which was suspended and then re-established, would lose its name and become the National Grand Lodge. And from this National Grand Lodge, it then became the Grand Orient of France. What is important to note here is that even for the Grand Orient of France, which celebrated 250 years of existence last year, even this GODF would see some developments from 1789, because the Duke of Montmorency and Luxembourg went into exile on the 15th of July 1789, the day after Bastille Day, and the Duke of Chartres, who I said who died, he went onto the guillotine. The Duke of Chartres resigned from the Masonry, and his head was chopped off in that same year, and we had to wait until 17 1999, before the Grand Lodge of Clermont would join the Grand Orient of France, and since 1799, that is how it has existed. Next slide, please. Is that the next slide? Okay, you can leave that slide there. So, that gives you an idea of the timeline of Masonry. I think it's useful to have that. Now, as it relates to these definitions of Grand Orient and Grand Lodge, this can be useful to know as well. The Ordinary Dictionary presents Grand Lodge as an obedience in which only one ritual is practiced, and a Grand Orient is an obedience in which you can practice several different rituals. Now, that is not necessarily how things were necessarily organized in the 18th century. We had to wait until the 19th century. So it wasn't necessarily presented in this manner in the 18th century. The term Grand Orient in the 18th century was not the same before 1773 and after 1773. Before 1773, regardless of what literature you read, the term Grand Orient is a local term. It is not, does not denote an institutional body of masonry. So, in 1766, the widow of the worshipful master wrote about the fact that she just became a widow. She was asking for support, and she wrote to all the worshipful masters of the lodges in the Grand Orient. Now, there may be some ambiguity here, but there is none, in fact. Your Grand Orient is the Paris location for all of the Grand Masters of Paris. Now, some other ambiguity that can slip in here is that in 1760, this is the copy of the register of the Grand Lodge of Masters of the Orient of Paris in 1760. And so here it says it's not the Grand Lodge of France here. Now, Grand Orient after 1773 would then become to mean a Masonic institution. That is something that is clear in literature. However, this is not clear for everyone, particularly for those Masons who don't know France. In archives in a lodge in Guadeloupe, I saw that they continue to write to Paris, to the Grand Lodge of France, to the National Grand Lodge of France. And so I wonder, when you read the correspondence that was sent to this Grand National Lodge of France, this Grand Lodge of France, the correspondence is addressed to the Baron of Toussaint. And when we know that the Baron of Toussaint was designated as the Secretary General of the Grand National Lodge of France in 1773 and remained so, or remained the Secretary General of the Grand Orient of France, we know that this confusion in terms of language does not necessarily signify very much. In terms of vocabulary, it's important also to remember that the makeup of French masonry can be expressed in various ways. In the texts, we see the term society, we also see the term brotherhood, we see the term order. And all of this appeared before 1773, although it can be found after that date, because the title that was given to the Grand Master, the Duke of Chartres, in October 1773, was the Grand Master, Royal Grand Master of the French Order. Now, the word used to designate the Masonic institution was the Masonic body, and that was the case from 1773. Now, between 1773 throughout the regeneration of the Grand Lodge of France, which was suspended in 1767 but was reactivated in June 1773, there was a National Grand Lodge of France, which is at the origin of the Grand Orient of France. There was also some dissidence here as well. Throughout this period, so from 1773, a majority of Masons declared themselves for the Grand Orient, but there was also a minority, an important minority, that refused to follow this reform that was begun by the Duke of Montmorency and Luxembourg. So the Grand Lodge of Orient was also called the Grand Lodge of Clermont. So in 1773, the lodge writes to the Grand Lodge of France and writes, the title is Deliberation of the Term Grand Lodge of France. And the officers who are writing here consider themselves as officers and masters of the Grand Orient of France, and so that's the second time that it appears in the letter. Following that, it speaks to the umbrella term of National Grand Lodge. So there are three different expressions here, and this does not make the study of this transition any easier. Can we move to the next slide, please? This transition is seen as the birth date of the Grand Orient of France, so October 1773. But it's much more complex than that. It's much more complex because we can see here on this figure that throughout this period that lasted from the 5th of March 1773 to the 1st of September 1773, what was often used and interchangeably Grand National Lodge of France or Grand Orient of France. Now, the table here becomes darker as we go to the right because there was an evolution in the minutes over this period. On the 17th of April 1773, this was the first report that was validated by the Baron of Toussaint, and this was the first time that we see the name Grand Orient of France. Before that, it was Grand Lodge of France. And nevertheless, it is not the Grand Orient of France, but it's the first time that this appeared. Now, on the 2nd of June 1773, we see the term seal, the seal of the Grand Orient of France. Another date, which is a key date for many historians as it relates to the creation of the Grand Orient of France, was the 26th of June 1773. Why? Because on that date, the new statutes that had been prepared since 1772 by a group of people that was validated on that specific day. And so the statutes of the Grand Orient of France in 4 chapters were adopted. It's also important to retain the 22nd of October 1773. This was the day, a Friday, where the Duke of Chartres installed the Grand Master of the Royal Order of France. And on the 27th of December 1773, this was the second in chronological terms, but in real terms it was the first General Assembly of the Grand Orient of France. So that is just to lay out the context of this period. We can move on to the next slide. So we went from Grand Lodge to Grand Orient. And Grand Orient was the end of 1773. Now, Grand Orient is not just a title because the revolution that led to the appearance or the arrival of the Grand Orient of France was not a simple title or label. It goes a lot deeper than this. And in fact, I should like to say that the Grand National Lodge of France met on the 5th of March, and this was the first national meeting. And during this meeting, it was proposed that the real meeting of the Grand National Lodge would be the 9th of March. Why the 9th of March? Well, because the day before that, the representatives of the provinces that they had attend to counterbalance the influence of the Grand Masters of Paris. On the day before, the 9th of March, there was a separate meeting that was requested. Now, I'm not sure if this meeting rings a bell in your mind, but in 1789, there was also another social group that demanded a separate meeting, the Third States. And so here we see the premises of the opposition. This is something, again, that is important to remember. Now, the expression Grand Orient, as I was saying, is not a simple label or title. Now, I'll discuss this in two parts. First of all, it's an administration with a center and a periphery with a very strong symbolic identity, with financial means, financial resources. That's something that's very, very important. And then I'll speak about how 1773 is not just the only date to remember, because between 1774 and 1784, in the Grand Orient, there was a continuation of the perfectioning of the statutes. Now, what is the Grand Orient of France? So it's an administration, and I'll be very quick in my explanation. There were three chambers, three houses: the administration chamber, the parish chamber, and the provincial chamber. Now, the Grand Orient had three offices: one for correspondence, one for finance, and a third office. And this is important to remember. What's also important to remember is that this institute defines what the Masonic body is. It's made up of all of the regular Masons in France. So it defines what the Grand Orient is. It's all of the regular worshipful masters of the lodges, both from Paris and from outside of Paris, as is stipulated in the text. This administration also equipped itself with definitions, but also vocabulary. Now, I think that the vocabulary is fairly interesting because we see this from the 22nd of October, 1773, and it's clearly expressed as such. Before this, there were minutes. There were rough copies of minutes, but they were punitive. You just have to read the text. But after the 23rd of October, 1773, the term minutes was no longer used, and instead they used the term tracing boards, and the use of these was institutionalized. And the Masonic passport was replaced by the term special certificate. So, a tracing board is the title of the report of the meeting of the Duc de Chartres. It's entitled Tracing Board, and this is the first official use and officialized use of the term. Now, in addition to this administration, which was structured, which had its own vocabulary, beyond that, something else arose. Even though it existed since 1764 in writing, something else became official in 1775, and that's tripunctuation, in printing, in the printings of the Grand Orient of France. The Grand Orient of France was organized in a centralist fashion and proposed templates for letters, or templates for building the chambers, for the patents, and the templates for the patents that were proposed in 1764 is the same template that existed until 1940 rather. This didn't change for over 2 centuries. Now, the Grand Orient of France thus has a range of vocabulary. It has its own administration and structure. Now let's come back to the seal, however. It also had a seal. So I mentioned that the first appearance of the so can be found in the minutes of the National Grand Lodge in 1773. The seal of the Grand Lodge, which was quite recent, in fact, which was created 10 years prior to that, the seal, what was the seal? Well, the seal was an oval, and within that oval there were 4 intertwined letters, G, D, L, F. So nothing Masonic about this. When the seal of the Grand Orient of France appeared, we do see masonry. It's the same seal, it has evolved. But here we have the we see an angle of 90 degrees for these of the squares, and perhaps the squares of the Grand Orient of France on their seal are not at 90 degrees. Now, I've been told that everything is symbolic, but 90 degrees is 90 degrees. So here you have the square, the compass, you have the fleur-de-lis in the triangle, again, still under the monarchy. It's the Royal Order of France, important to remember. And all of this is surrounded by vegetation. I think there's an olive branch. There's a very good description of that first seal by Routier in the documents that were collected in the 1930s. Now, this seal is also interesting rather, because the Duke of Luxembourg on the 22nd of November 1773 wrote a memo in which he was very clear in this respect. As I said to you earlier on, there were some dissidents, in fact, dissidents of the Grand Lodge of Clermont or the Grand Orient of Clermont. And a few days later, until the 1780s, in their text, the Duke of Luxembourg claimed to be the Grand Master of the Grand Orient. And so in the memo on the 22nd of September 1773, he says quite clearly that the old or the former seals were abolished. He used a very strong term, and he said that this is the new stamp. It's not a seal really, but a stamp. It's the new stamp of the Grand Orient of France. And that was clear in that memo. And that was accompanied on the 27th of December, so that's a famous date that I suggested, that I mentioned as the real beginning of the Grand Orient of France's activities. So the 27th of December, what do the brothers say, the members say? They say very clearly that they have to remove any trace of prior decisions made by the Grand Orient of France. That's what is said quite explicitly, that any trace must be removed. So the explanation of the switch from Grand Lodge to Grand Orient can be found there too. It is said quite clearly that we have to break down the former construction to replace it with a new one. That is said very explicitly. So basically, they started from scratch. Next slide, please. So the Grand Orient was not satisfied with this vertical administration. That said, that verticality was also accompanied by democracy. That must be remembered, because in principle, officially, anything that was decided upon by the Grand Orient of France was decided upon by the assemblies of the Grand Orient of France, by the sovereign lodges, and in particular by the lodges outside of Paris. But the lodge also had a budget, and I would compare this with the budget of the Grand Lodge 10 years later. Now, the Grand Lodge of France was mainly Parisian. The Grand Orient had to coordinate and govern all lodges in France. But this was really the beginning, so 1775. And what I see here is that the income of the Grand Orient are 8 times higher than that of the Grand Lodge. And this means that the Grand Orient had quite a lot of expenditure. Now, there is a stark difference here as well. The worshipful masters had their own systems, and so the worshipful masters of Paris found ways to bring in income. And with the Grand Orient of France, everything changed. To have a new constitution, the cost was £120. Pounds is equivalent to 12 euros today. So 120 by 12, this gives you what the price of a new constitution. Now, the grand officers of the Grand Orient of France were significantly taxed. They had to make a donation of £150, times that by 12 to get your euros. That's a lot. And then there was a contribution of £150. So a donation is just once, really. But here, the first year, it was 150 years as a welcome donation, and then £150 contribution. And then they also received tokens. So in total, they had £356, times that by 12, that's 4,000 euros. And that was the investment of a grand officer of France at that time. Now, this did not last, but the Grand Orient had some debts and needed this money. So it's important to note that one of the specificities of the Grand Orient compared to the Grand Lodge was that until 1764, since the Grand Lodge was nomadic, after August 1764, it set up. But this venue, was not its own. And so the Grand Lodge was actually a tenant of that venue. So there was a Putzfair Road, the first address, the former home of the Jesuits that were chased out 10 years prior. So the cost to maintain this venue was £5,000, times that by 12 to get euros. That was the budget of the Grand Orient of France at that time. The Grand Lodges were also taxed, but not as much, just £3, which is doable. The brothers, not the lodges, rather, the brothers, it was £3. They didn't really want to call it a tax. They found another term, the free donation. Now, the free donation, it was explained that for the lodges, well, we need money, the lodges need money, so you can give whatever you can, as much as you can. That was the expression in the text. So it was a free donation. But you know, and they would say that there are overheads. And so the only comment to make here is that the income must also be constant, just like our overheads. So that was a subtlety in the language. I think that it's very Jesuitic to say it's free, but it's obligatory. So the Grand Orient equipped itself with a war machine, if you will, because from that time on, they had the resources to operate. And if you read the descriptions of the temples decorated for the reception of the Grand Masters, it's something quite phenomenal. Gold everywhere, candelabras, crystal, pink, purple, all manner of colours. It was very expensive. In actual fact, the first year of the budget in 1764, the first year, the Grand Orient had 6,000 euros in debt. So just imagine, at the rate that they were taxing the brothers, they were able to reduce their debt by half the following year. So that was the Grand Orient. And I think this also explains the strong centralized administration that corresponded. And actually, I'll take a pause here to discuss the term correspondence. There was an office for correspondence, and in the Masonic literature at the time, in fact, we often see that the lodges were entitled Lodges of the Correspondence. Actually, they weren't entitled Lodges of France. They were called Lodges of the Correspondence. And in Masonic dictionaries, in Contan's dictionary or the Grand Orient dictionary of 1821, they say that a lodge of the correspondence is equivalent to lodge of the obedience of the Grand Orient of France. So it's important to remember that the vocabulary was also subverted.
As I said earlier, the Grand Orient doesn't date back from 1773. There are several dates. They go beyond 1773. So on this graph, I've tried to map out the activity of the Grand Orient de France from 74 to 84. Here you can see histograms in dark blue, and in the continuity, light blue. What does it mean? It shows the number of assemblies of the GODF at that time, 14 assemblies per year. Not a general assembly necessarily, but 14 per year. When it's in red, it means that it's above the average. The average is here, 14. So you can see that there's more or less 2 periods of time. On the left-hand side of the dark line, you can see, and on the right-hand side. So from 74 to 79 or 78, we see that the GODF activity is quite significant. And then above those histograms, you can see a curve. How did I calculate this? The written minutes of the GODF session is always, it shows the same handwriting. So I thought that if I calculated in the minutes the number of lines, and within this number of lines, the number of lines that correspond to decisions of the GODF, the results should be more or less consistent. So that's what you can see here. On the left-hand side, the curve is above the one you see on the right-hand side. So from 74 to 77, the GODF's meetings continued to use the statutes and regulations of the GODF. It doesn't stop all of a sudden in 73. In October 73, it continues. And something should catch your attention. The Duke of Luxembourg, the 15 officers of honor that he nominated, they couldn't be changed. That means that they're going to be elected. There are elections at the GODF. There are elections every year or every 3 years for the centralized structure. But we are re-elected on a regular basis, not the Duke of Clermont, not the Duke of Chartres, not the officers. And we realized that quite early on, from 1775, and the official texts say so, it follows the initiative of the Duke of Luxembourg. That's why it's a very interesting character. From the high aristocracy, and in a democratic way, with regular elections, it means that a Crown Prince must suggest, and the Duke of Chartres will do it as well, but it will be rejected, to be subjected to the elections as well. It won't change anything. They will be re-elected every year. He will leave in 1789, but he was still the general administrator of the GODF. But from 75, he becomes elected. It means that he's not nominated anymore. He had been elected in 71 and 73, and now he's regularly re-elected every 3 years. I think that it's quite interesting to have that in mind. So we go from a Grand Lodge from up to 66 with a sort of administration. There was a treasurer, there was a secretary, there was a Grand Master, of course. But it was an administration that only had authority in Paris or in the Paris suburbs. And it was in competition, you should remember, with the Grand Lodges from the provinces. For instance, the Rosier Abbey priest was a representative of the Grand Lodge of Lyon in Paris in 73. So there were Grand Lodges in the provinces. And that's what I'm trying to simplify in my final document. It's going to be my conclusion. I'm trying, on this graph, I'm trying to explain that the GODF lived for 250 years without completely changing its methods. Even the administrative papers, as we saw earlier, the patents that were the same until 1940. What is the Grand Orient de France at the end of the reform of the Duke of Luxembourg? First of all, it's a center, so it's still a centralized organization, the GODF, and the revolution will do more or less the same, and then Napoleon again afterwards. At its center, you've got two people in charge, the Duke of Chartres, the Grand Maître, and of Montmorency, the general administrator. And then you have the Grand Conservator, who has more or less the same status, but doesn't have the same impact on the Grand Orient than Montmorency and Luxembourg. So that's in 1793. It's created, it exists. And then in the 73 rather. Then in the second circle, you've got the symbolic lodges. And that's what the Duke of Luxembourg did. And it was a genius action to associate the provinces. So you've got the symbolic lodges of Paris and the symbolic lodges of the provinces. That's in 1773. Everyone has a say. And the lodges in the provinces showed it from the 8th of March 1773, when they organized a meeting aside. Third circle, the Grand Orient, also has lodges of adoption, 1774. And he recognizes the lodges of adoption, the female lodges, in 74. And that same year, we decide that the worshipful will be the worshipful master of the Grand Orient de France lodges. So the lodges of adoption are with women, but the worshipful is still a man. What's interesting is that I've got two dates, 74, when we recognize the lodges of adoption, but above 75, because in 75, despite it all, the lodges of adoption have two grand mistresses, the sister of the Duke of Orleans, the mother of the Duc d'Enghien that will be killed by Napoleon, because it was a risk of the reintroduction of the monarchy too fast. So the Grand Mistress, Mathilde d'Orléans, that was more or less a revolutionary person. She's the Grand Mistress of the lodges of adoption. She's the sister of Philippe Égalité. And then the last circle in red, the Grand Orient, as you know, at a later stage, more or less recognizes the symbolic lodges. But when you're in politics, you make compromise. And it started before. In 1772, the Grand Lodge had already merged with the Sovereign Council of the Emperors from Orient and Occident. It was in August 1772. At that time, it's not called the Grande Lodge de France, but Honorable Grand Lodge of France, until 1773. But in 1776, the Grand Orient, that still didn't recognize the high degrees, signs an agreement with Scottish directorates, Marseille, Lyon, and Strasbourg. If you read the explanation that's given, it's quite far-fetched. They say yes, but actually the degrees that are practiced in the symbolic lodges of the Scottish Rite, it's not that far from what we practice. Well, the high degrees, they admit that those directoires that are going to merge with the Grand Orient of France are going to be loyal to the GODF. And they don't recognize the high degrees, but they still integrate them. This circle is framed by three or four things. First of all, as I said, a centralized administration with 3 chambers. That's the strength of the GODF. It's got a budget, it's got funds. I'm not going to go back to it. And then there might be a triangle at the top. It would be a temple. On the left, on the right, 2 columns. There's 1 column made of formal, real relationships with the Masonic territory. That's what I called correspondence, because behind this term, there's the idea that there's a very specific monitoring of the relationship with the provinces. Everything must be recorded when letters are sent or received. Those are the official letters. And then another column with the seals. And amongst what's new at the GODF is the mot de semestre, the semestre word. In 1773, something happens that is at the origin of the mot semestre. It appears in 1774. It's the semester's word. And later on, we decide that it's something sacred and that it has to be spelled out. The first use of the brothers that will take part in the GODF banquet is 1773. And that's when the Duke of Chartres officially becomes master. He is not yet a Duke of Orleans. So a banquet is organized. And then the General Secretary says, we need to check all of this. We need to control it. We need to make sure that all the people who are integrating this lodge are in favor of the GODF and recognize as such. So that's not the mot semestre, the semester's word. That will take place in 1774. But you can see that in 73, 74, we see the seal, specific terminology, the administration, the finances, all this starts appearing. Everything that makes the GODF, which means that it was able to go through revolutions, wars, centuries. And the longest Grand Lodge was the Clermont Grand Lodge, 73-99. That was the longest lodge, and the other ones are shorter. And then in the meantime, there are dissidents. So that's where the Duke de Montmorency in Luxembourg was a pioneer. He built an organization that was going to be successful, and at the same time he introduced democracy with voting, and that's it. I'm done.
C'est l'heure du repas.
Pierre.
C'est hallucinant.
Oui, alors moi je m'intéresse.
I was wondering about when the word appeared. We talked about it. And what I found striking when I read documents published, if I remember well, by Forestier on the elected Cohen, Martinez de Pasquale in the 60s writes from the Grand Orient de France. It shows that the phrase dated from before 73, but it's more of a geographical conception. It's more of a national Orient. And also what I really found interesting was your first comment at the beginning, the fact that the Grand Lodge is one right, the Grand Orient is two rights. It was a creation, but I thought that it was internal to Freemasonry, and dictionaries then use those terms, and it's quite curious to see that it appears in dictionaries that are external to Freemasonry.
Vous l'avez compris, l'exposé de Jean-Luc, ça reflète.
So as you've understood, Jean-Luc's presentation shows that in 1773, the Grand Orient de France created Freemasonry bureaucracy. In 1889, the Grand Orient celebrates the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. It aspires to having played a significant role in those events in 89. But as we all know, actually the revolutionaries quite early on started persecuting the lodges. Could you tell us more about the relationships between the lodges? The Girondins and the Montagnards. Where does this attack come from against the lodges during the French Revolution? It's not exactly the heart of your topic. We know when the lodges are closed down. 3 or 4 keeps getting together in a clandestine way, but 3 or 4 is nothing. From 93, they don't get together anymore. They suspended. That's at that time. During the Great Revolution. And they start again only 3 to 4 times later. In 1796, 97. I didn't talk about Montalot, but it's an interesting character for the next century. For the 18th century as well, because what we sometimes forget is that Roitier de Montalot, a bit like the Pingré priest from the Sainte-Geneviève Library, he was a brother of the Northern Star, and he's the saver of the archives of the Grand Orient de France. He's the one who hid them, and that's why we can work today. And Roitier de Montalot is the father of the French Rite, apart from this. So from 96 to 97, Roitier de Montalot becomes the patron of Freemasonry. The Grand Master has been beheaded, and at the same time, he's working with his team, and they continue to maintain the French Rite that was created a few years earlier. No. They are unifying Freemasonry as well. They want the Grand Orient de France from 73 and the Grand Lodge of Clermont from 73 as well to get together. He's the one who created this union of 1789 that we call the Concordat, the same as the one that will take place a few years later. So that's my answer. The timeline, 1793. I might be wrong, but what I feel is that in 1889, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, the way we perceive the event matches the way the GODFs changed itself from the inside. It's in a revolution. It's a bit of a projection of the first revolution from 1789. Yes, that's pretty obvious. Each institution in history will use what it finds helpful in its administration. It's no longer history, but more propaganda. Thank you. Two questions that might be more anecdotal. The first one, we saw that there's a difference between the meanings of Orient, several rights. These are reconstructions. But maybe when we choose the Orient, does it mean that we want, is there a divide? Because this reform could have taken place whilst keeping the same name, because the National Grand Lodge also means something in itself. So is this what has provoked this change? Do we have explanations of what has brought this change in the name? Pierre Mollier was talking about bureaucracy. That's my second question. And where I'm struggling to understand it in concrete terms, how did this bureaucracy work? Was it based on volunteers? Were there staff? What was the number of people working for this new structure? Well, I'll start by answering the last question. The number, well, I haven't studied it in detail, but there was a specific number. The minutes were written by the brothers. That was the primitif until October 1773, and then sketch, esquisse, and then it became a procès-verbal, a minute. That was done by the brothers. Like today, today you designate someone who will take notes. Regarding the rest, they were what we could call civil servants of the Grand Orient. They were paid for this. The person who was above it all, more or less, was the servant Jacquinet. He was managing all this, and we see his name from time to time in Masonic literature. Regarding the choice, it's a bit ambiguous because, as I said, the first seal dates from the 2nd of June, seal of the Grand Orient. But the future dissidents start becoming agitated, but they are not becoming aggressive yet. That will only taking place on the 30th of June. And that's what the Duke of Luxembourg says. They want to change it all. They want to erase it all and build from scratch. And that was quite clear at the time. But I think that that idea then was accelerated by the resistance of the Masters of the Lodge of Paris. They thought it wasn't very serious. But we still have to have this nuance in mind. The Grand Lodge was in Paris, the Grand Lodge of Paris, and there were lots of bourgeois people from Paris. And with the Duke of Montmorency of Luxembourg, if you look at the 15 officers of honor that he nominates, starting with his brother, Duke of something, Count of that. So they are two worlds separated here. And this is going to go on because amongst the first decisions made by the assemblies of the GODF from 1774 is that we will stop recruiting craftsmen if they are not masters. Masters in the meaning of the Le Pelletier law. if they're apprentice, compagnon, they can't join. They can't enter. No more comedians. I haven't really understood why, but twice we intervened to refuse the initiation of actors, of comedians, and that's the Duke of Luxembourg who wants to organize all this, because in the 60s it was a bit of a mess, and so he wants to create something that matches his own world, because all the people who surround him, and that's the same for the Masonry of Adoption. If you look at the people who made the Masonry of Adoption, it's a duchess, a countess, etc. So there's a real divide here. And then afterwards, after the revolution, and the fact that the empire then reintroduced a more ordinary social part, even though they will one day also have new titles, become counts and dukes, etc., and princes. Later on, we will see more diversity in terms of sociology, but at that time, it's a big change. But that's what I'm talking about is for Paris, because that's not the case for the provinces. However, in the provinces, sometimes in the same city, you had a lodge with bourgeois people and another one with aristocrats. It did exist. And then sometimes with religious people, because the religious people also had their own lodges. So yes, there was a divide that worked.
Mais puisque tu parles de la maçonnerie, d'adoption et de bâtiment.
Since you're talking about masonry of adoption and the Orient, I don't understand why the female lodges disappeared in 1870. The female lodges disappeared from the GODF. Do we know why? I don't know if they disappeared in 1870. They were already considered in existence since the beginning, the middle of the 18th century. The female lodges lost their wind, if you will. So the women of the male workshops are associated to masonry, but for great works. So women were involved, that is clear, but they weren't initiated. And that took place since the 1870s. Was there a decision that I don't know about? Well, in the literature, it says that before 1870, if I'm not mistaking the date, there were 10 female lodges. Well, 10 lodges, that isn't very much. There were very many more under the empire. And female masonry started to disappear, really, at the start of the Restoration period. So there may have been 10 lodges that remained, but women were put in their place, quote unquote. They were worked on behalf of their husbands' lodges, in fact, and they did this on a voluntary basis, in fact. First and foremost, I would like to present my apologies, but they took a lot of time in the other temple. The question that I have is about the designation. Who invented this notion of Grand Orient, and did any other designations exist prior to this, other terms? Well, Grand Orient did already exist. To be very brief, because we already discussed this, Grand Orient existed in the literature before 1773, but the meaning was different. When a lodge was in the orange of a city, we use the term Grand Orient for the mother lodges or provincial lodges, or the lodge of the Count of Clermont in Paris. So before 1773, Grand Orient was used in the capital. And the capital could have been Lyon, in fact, because I found letters dated from that time where they used the term Grand Orient of Lyon. So it meant capital in the etymological sense of the term. After 1773, Grand Lodge of France was removed. There was to be no more trace of this, and a decision was made to transform the term Grand Orient, which meant place, to Grand Orient in the sense that it meant institution. France was the first to use this term, is that correct? Yes, of course. The first Grand Orient was the Grand Orient of France, GODF. Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the question that you raised pertaining to the sociology of the lodges. They may have been aristocratic and there was perhaps a third state present, but in this sociology, can we find the explanation for the disappearance of lodges from the French landscape in 1773? Given that there were such contradictions in French society as it relates to this very old regime. So that's the first point that I'd like to raise. The second is to do with the ability or the capacity of Freemasonry, how should I put this, to recover or to have an idea of what their enemies were saying about them, in particular the fact that the Freemasonry was the origin of the French Revolution. So this is something that is said, but when you look into detail, this is not actually, doesn't come too clear. Now, this next point is paradoxical, but it's quite interesting. So the structure, even though it was broken down, it did persist, the original structure, and that's great. So despite the meanders of history, it continued to exist, which demonstrates that the structure was actually sound. That's what I said, and that's why I said that I reconstructed that, but that was the result. Now, as it relates to the sociology aspect of your question, the lodges were not prohibited. They censored, and this began before 1773. So, for example, the Grand Lodge of Clermont in 1789 placed itself under the authority of the Grand Master of the Duke of Chartres in 1790. So a year after the revolution, they retained the title Grand Master, but they removed the Duke d'Orléans. So this self-censoring began in 1790. And in 1793, everything stopped. Just a few continued to work for 3 or 4 years. But for 3 or 4 years, there was no active Freemasonry in Paris. There was in the provinces, but the provinces aren't Paris. Do we know from when the term Orient began to be used in continental Masonry? Because the term East is never used in the UK to designate a locality. Well, since the 1730s, we've been using the term Orient to designate a locality. Yes, my question. Well, we understand how this happened, and we see that it works, but were there any places in Paris or any provinces that resisted and that would continue to have a structure that was locally centered, so in the provinces in the southwest, for example? Well, throughout this period, how should I put this? The great provincial lodges remained alert. At the beginning of the 1800s, the lodges entitled Grand Scottish Lodges also had a desire to reaffirm themselves. It wouldn't be successful, but indeed in the provinces there were grand provincial lodges in Marseille, Toulouse, Bordeaux, Lyon, Strasbourg. They were satellite lodges. So in those cities that I mentioned, those lodges did demand a certain level of autonomy. They did not have the agreement of the Scottish director. And in 1773, the Grand Orient wasn't strong enough to impose itself, so they had to negotiate. But they did have in mind unification and centralization. This is the last question. Now, to get back to the crux of the matter as it relates to the transformation of this term, or the development of the term Grand Orient, in the André Doré library, there were military patents that were at the orient of the regiment. So the notion of orient is about location. And when you want to find out where the orient is, you have to find out the location of the regiment at that time to ascertain in what city they resided. Well, that's a great conclusion. One final question, perhaps? Question off mic. The interpreter apologizes. We did not hear the question. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.